Okay, class, here is chapter 6 video lecture. One of the resources that I included for chapter 6, it is now posted also on week 4 tab, but the website is www.ismho.org. This is the International Society for Mental Health Online. This is a great organization that has lots of free resources regarding online mental health issues. And then they have a whole research section that you can go on that talks about some of the best practices, standard for online practices, recent publications. But you can sign up to get their newsletter. We're just going to look at some of the latest trends and also what research is on here for telehealth. Okay. So I think there is a fee, but letting you know is that, you can get some of these resources for free. So please make sure you take advantage of that. So again, that's posted under week 4 in your Blackboard. I know some of you don't have access to this, so I'll send you the link separately. And then don't forget, after you've watched chapter 5 and chapter 6, these are the self-reflection questions here that I would like for you to just make sure you take some time to reflect on these, and then we will discuss when we meet next week. You're welcome to email them to me if you kind of want to get some feedback. But I definitely want to discuss this when we meet again next week, okay? And then if you already go to week 4, and for those of you that don't have it, I'll also send a link. Here is the meeting link for Zoom. You can just copy and paste that onto your browser. I just realized right now that this is kind of like all stuck together, so I'll separate that so that you can click on it from here as well. Okay, so chapter 6 deals with telephone and online crisis counseling. So let's go ahead and get started. So this no other than perfect timing regarding the current situation that we're in, that we've moved a lot of counseling programs online. So the current venue of telephone use in crisis counseling, this is what we're going to talk about today. But clearly, right now we are in a wave of online crisis counseling, and it's growing at such staggering rates that it's sometimes hard to keep up with research and e-therapy protocols that are used that follow legal and ethical guidelines. So that's some of the things that we're going to cover today as well. And so just remember, a resource for you is that International Society for Mental Health Online. Okay. Moving forward. And then don't forget that you do have all these notes embedded into the PowerPoint slides. So I won't spend too much time lecturing because some of these you can read yourself, but I will still go over them with you. So why has there been a staggering rate in the increase of crisis online or telehealth? One is convenient, and it's huge. And this is because it allows people to call from anywhere, including, if they're in a current crisis. And now with smartphones, now clients can, speak to their therapist. They can access self-help groups. They can access chat rooms. And so it also decreases kind of like social isolation, which we'll talk a little bit more later on. And reason why other people like it is client anonymity. Lots of times when you do have to make an appointment to go to speak to somebody face-to-face, they tend to feel a lot of guilt and embarrassment, shame, self-blame, or other just emotions that can be very debilitating that would prohibit somebody from coming to talk to you. This is why even for us at Poly High School, we have a way for students to submit a counseling request online, because we know that some students might prefer to send us that, and rather than initially coming in and having to explain what's happening. And so that allows for us to call the kid in and like kind of put them at ease. And then and so offering clients multiple ways to engage with you in counseling or in crisis counseling can be very effective. And so Also for control, there's a great deal of fear and anxiety and uncertainty when a client's life is ruptured by a crisis. So the concept of secondary victimization by institutions kind of is looked at because we know that there are lots of victims who are in a crisis who have sought assistance from agencies and then again have been re-victimized themselves by the different bureaucratic policies that are put in place or by people being callous with them. And so this is really important, for example, for people who have experienced sexual assault or victims of, bad relationships or where there's abuse. It's so important that, when they do go get help, that they're able to get concrete, solid help and not get kind of stuck in the red tape that happens with different agencies. And then also the immediacy of access. And so there's no cost for people to call free helplines or get sometimes online help. And so that's really important. So that's one of the other reasons is cost effectiveness. Just know that a lot of volunteers are paid for out of like United Way or other charitable organizations, and that mostly people of limited financial means who can afford face-to-face counseling, they're the ones that this is kind of like their best option. And then also therapeutic effectiveness. So lots of volunteers or workers who staff crisis lines are very important in suicide intervention. And so although some of them may be volunteers, this is a great way to get experience in crisis counseling. I know that as a graduate student, you can volunteer with 211, you can volunteer with the 911 call center. So this is all a great experience for you. And I always kind of tell my students that, volunteer places where you're going to be challenged to grow. Because then when you are in your real setting, things are just going to feel so much easier for you because you did handle those as a fieldwork student with a supervisor. And it's better to do that than be, kind of not have that experience and then be put in a position where you're in that situation and then you have no fieldwork supervisor or no one able to collaborate with you and help you through the situation. So especially right now, if those of you that are like struggling to get hours, maybe call up your local 211 or get in contact with your local dispatch center. They are probably needing lots of volunteers right now and a way for you to get hours and to do crisis counseling. So there's a lot of contempt by professionals for crisis counseling, and research indicates that they're probably just as good as other face-to-face counseling, and especially for people who don't have financial access to professional therapists. So some of the things that we're going to talk about too is, when we're handling cases online or doing online telehealth. So one of the major reasons people call hotlines is for social support. Many people who are lonely, anxious, or isolated by physical illness are in need of support. So especially right now, think of people who are having to be in isolation, who can't, come in contact with families, or perhaps were diagnosed and all they have is their cell phone. This is a great resource for them to be able to access, social supports, but also personal social support during times like this. So some people actually, believe it or not, are shut-ins. They are shy. They don't feel, positive about their body image. They're recently divorced. They're widowed. They're abused. They have an addiction. They have panic attacks. Perhaps they have leprosy or another skin disease. And so access to telehealth or to these type of support rooms is crucial for them. And then it's also important to make sure that you avoid and are aware of dependency issues. So because the telephone crisis line can become dependent on particular workers, and so once they get to know you, they might call and they might ask for you. So it's important to make sure you're not always readily available, or that you know what the policies are, that people can't ask for you or that they have to ask for somebody else. Because remember, when you're volunteering at a crisis hotline, you're there to handle specific immediate crises, not do long-term therapy appointments. Okay. The other thing is, I went too fast. Sorry. Worker anonymity. So this has a lot of benefits, and also for the client as well. But we're really aware that you're not going to be able to view body language or facial expressions or visual images. But however, sometimes this allows for the client to kind of conjure up their own view of the therapist, which can be positive, and same vice versa. If you don't know what your client looks like, you only hear their voice. And so this can also detach you from making any kind of pre-assumed assumptions or prejudgmental notions that could happen. Availability for others of consultation. Sometimes it's a plus, sometimes it's a not. If you are working at a center where you can easily pull up a chat box when you're encountering a difficult client, which we will talk about, or if you can phone in somebody else for support, that's great. But also know that you may also be in a position where this may not be available to you. And so you're just going to have to make sure you have every resource and kind of guide with you when you're doing crisis online counseling. Some people volunteer for after hours crisis counseling. And this is done like in their own home, and they're given a pager and kind of set up with a county phone. And so, if that's the case, you're not going to have somebody to rely on. And so just know that, kind of be wary of how you're going to volunteer and how it's going to be set up. And then, of course, availability of an array of services. So there's a lot of information, guidance, and social services that are quickly available via telephone linkages. So this is very helpful in linking people with crisis supports. And then you're able to service a large isolated geographic areas. So, for example, in California, I think of people in the Central Valley who don't have access to like large cities or centers, and is not allowed out there. So they can rely on telephone crisis lines to get help. They might not have, a nearby hospital emergency room, or they may be homebound. Also think of people who are elderly. They're not able to kind of make a drive that's like 20, 30 miles, to get mental health, or perhaps they're physically disabled. So sometimes these are really convenient for them. Okay. So now moving on to handling telephone counseling, kind of best practice strategies. The first thing is really important is that psychological contact needs to be made, and this takes precedence over anything else that you do as a telephone worker or telephone crisis counselor. Physiological contact means that the worker attempts to establish as quickly as possible a non-judgmental, caring, accepting, empathetic relationship with the client that will give the worker credibility and elicit the client's trust. Therefore, provide support becomes the first order of business, and it's safe to assume that people who use crisis lines have exhausted or are separated from their support system. So if the client feels no trust with you, they may hang up the phone, and you may not be able to find out what's going on. Also, make sure that you define the problem and that you ensure safety. So once psychological contact is established, you have to define the problem by gaining an understanding of the events that led to the crisis, by assessing the client's coping mechanisms, open-ended questions that we talked about before: what, how, when, where, and who. Usually let you get a clear picture of what is happening with the event. And then during problem definition, you have to be very specific in determining the client's lethality level. So we've talked about this already last week. Make sure always assess for suicidality or intent to harm someone else. If the worker detects that the potential for physical injury, then close-ended questions to obtain information specific to the client should be asked. So this is the only time that you can ask those close-ended questions when you're assessing somebody for suicidality. Do you have access to a gun? Are you alone? Or is someone there with you that can help you? Those are the times where it's okay to ask close-ended questions. So looking at alternatives and making plans. So creating plans and formulating a plan are, a big part of any crisis situation. Alternatives need to be explored in a slow, kind of stepwise manner with check-in by the client so you can role play, you can do verbal rehearsal, and having the client, reciprocate objectives and vital ingredients of the functional plan. So say, for example, if the plan includes them accomplishing something, what are the things that are needed to accomplish that? So identifying them as well. No plan should be accepted until the client can reassure the worker that he or she thoroughly understands the plan and has the means and ability to put it into action. And then, of course, we've talked about this before, obtaining commitment. It's huge. Commitment to a plan of action generated over the phone should be simple, specific, and time limited. Remember, this isn't long-term counseling or long-term therapy or even short-term therapy. It's immediate. So your plan should be just immediately to get this person back into a stable mode. Okay, so these are some of the clients who are severely disturbed and can be abusive callers. We talked a lot about the bipolar BPD before, so I'm not going to go into detail on all of these because I did put this on the slide notes, but these are the ones that, I definitely want you to be familiar with. Paranoid, schizoid, schizopathal, narcissistic people, histrionic, obsessive compulsive, bipolar, dependent, self-defeating, avoidant, passive-aggressive, and people with borderline personality disorder. But we are going to talk about severely disturbed callers because this does happen. It can happen to you if you ever were to volunteer or work at a crisis hotline. So these people have like a cornucopia of mental illnesses. They can be delusional. They can be hallucinatory. They may be unable to remotely test what they are doing, believing, or thinking. These people are so distanced from our own reality and so threatening that at the beginning, if this is your first time being a phone counselor, your immediate reaction might be to get off the phone. However, if you picture the disturbed client as someone who obviously has developmental issues and mental health issues, then it can become less intimidating. So no matter how bizarre the call may be, making sure that you're calm and you follow your guidelines, that's always going to help you. So some tips for handling severely disturbed callers. Obviously, one is slowing down emotions, so focusing on the here and now. So, for example, do not elicit more feelings with open-ended questions such as, can you tell me more about that? Instead, use calming interventions that force a person to order and think small and talk about realistic bits of detail. Never share in hallucinations or delusions. If a caller is hallucinating or delusional, the telephone worker, you should never side with their psychotic ideation. Determine if there's any type of medication usage. If at all possible, you should get information such as, are you under any prescribed medication? Have you taken any medication today? Around what time and what dosage? Do you remember how much you took? So those are questions that definitely you should ask and always assess as part of your conversation. So regardless of the reasons or excuses clients give you for not taking medication, you should always try to get them to take their prescribed medication or work with their psychiatric provider or their physician so that medication can be adjusted or reinstituted. So always keeping expectations realistic. As a telephone worker, no caller became disturbed overnight, and no crisis worker, you're not going to change psychotic behavior in one phone call. So just, it's okay to tell yourself that and be aware of that. So the crisis worker, what you're doing is you're buying time for the caller in a paranoid of high anxiety, and you're trying to get them to restore some control into their current reality. Always maintain professional distance. So calls from severely disturbed individuals may evoke all kinds of threatening feelings in you, leaving you feeling inadequate or confused or in crisis yourself. This also happens when people share information that's very traumatic. So, say, for example, they're calling because they did something really bad or something really bad happened to them. If you're having any type of those feelings, right away contact your supervisor. It's important to like make sure that if any of these if feelings arise, that you either change the call to a different worker, consult with somebody. Know that it's not you. It's normal to have some of these reactions, and as you get more and more experience, there may be then situations that then you do become comfortable with, and there may be situations that you're never going to be comfortable with, and that's okay. So, another thing is to avoid placating. So, making sure that you're empathetic versus sympathetic. So, for example, when someone's really feeling down on themselves, I think I put an example in the notes. If the caller is saying, things like, I'm just not good with anybody, much less myself, saying things like, I know it sounds pretty hopeless right now, but let's talk about what you were feeling when things weren't this way. Or let's talk about what you were doing that you weren't doing now. And so kind of reshifting their thought, disturbing those negative thought processes to so that we know that, okay, like, yes, we feel you, but let's move forward. And then always, and I can't stress this enough, is assess lethality. Not just suicidal, but also homicidal ideation. So obviously, when we're dealing with K through 12, we talk about, harm to self and harm to others. As for adults, unfortunately, this is homicide we're talking about. So people who call a crisis line, sometimes they're bent on harming themselves, or they call to give clues about harming other people. And so it's important to know what keywords to listen for and to get as much training in this area as possible. We're never going to be 100% prepared, but at least so that you're familiar with a lot of this. And so I'll see if I can send you guys also a resource on assessing for homicidal thoughts and ideation, because that's, unfortunately, in today's society, that is something that you may come face to face with. Also, though, I did want to share that if they are suicidal and they're calling you, that's a positive, because they're attempting to place a buffer between the action and themselves. And so that right there off the bat is a positive for you to get them help. Now we're going to talk about other problem callers. Now, the first one, I know it says rappers. It's not like they're rapping a song for you, but it's people that they call them rappers because they just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And so these are people who are lonely, or remember, they might be calling and maybe want to be dependent on you. So it's important to kind of like allow them to vent, but then set reasonable time limits. If there's no issue of a crisis present, then letting them know, like, okay, I appreciate your calling. I can link you with some resources where you can connect with some other people. And then just know, like, these calls are timed. And so, I'm going to have to turn this over, or turn this call over in a couple of minutes. And so letting them know that. There's also something called covert callers, where they call and they're saying they're asking for help for someone else, but it's actually about themselves. Or they may even say things like, oh, you must be crazy to work there. And so they're kind of testing you. So you can say things like, I hear that you're wondering if calls here are handled seriously. And so that kind of like breaks that thought process. Obviously, pranksters and nuisance callers. These are people who are calling just to, I don't know, to be disruptive. Know that this is also very serious. And there have people that have been arrested or have been, sued by the city or, tasked with a huge bill if they're pranking 911 or things like that, because it can put into place like an array of like response services. And I recall seeing this something on the news. I don't know if you guys remember, where somebody was making a prank phone call on their boss and they called 911, and then like the police came and the fire department and ambulance, and everything was fine, and the guy got arrested, and then he also had to pay that huge bill. Also, some callers call and they're silent. And this can be real, just uneasy. So just know that, before you hang up, you can say things like, I'll be here when you feel you're ready to talk. Or, if you're not ready, let's set up a time for you to call me back. Things like that to kind of get that person to know that you're there when they're ready to communicate, but also that you showed an attempt. And also that you are demonstrating acceptance, but also that you're not just sitting there on the phone, in silence. Also, other problem callers, manipulators, sexual explicit callers, or callers with legitimate sexual problems. So this is important to know because we talked a lot about bipolar disorder individuals, and those are going to be your manipulators. And also when you go back to the other types of problem callers, the narcissistic callers, those are also under this manipulation kind of heading. But something to be aware of is that some people call and they're very sexually explicit. If they say things like that, you can say things like, I think you're going to be better served with someone that is also the same sex as you. I'm going to go ahead and transfer you. And so they do that. And you can go ahead and do that and transfer them to a different worker, that you're working with, so that you can also make sure you put up that barrier that, that's not going to be allowed. And then they might not call back, because remember, when they call, they're going to get your name. They might call back and ask for you. But there are also callers with legitimate sexual problems. So keep in mind, this is something so personal that they might have sexually related problems. And because it allows them to be anonymous when they call a crisis line, they're not going to be embarrassed to describe and talk about such private issues. This is why sometimes these types of callers will call into a crisis line. However, you have to be prepared to handle that type of shock. And so make sure that you educate yourself on different sexual related problems and spend some time maybe like looking at things like that. What could those be? So that you are educated in dealing with sexual concerns, and that you follow all legal and ethical knowledge in terms of what to do if this were something to come up. So providing options and information about responsible sex is a great approach. Although, there's a very fine line between the worker's own biases and providing balanced information. So make sure like you always kind of ask, like, if this were to come up, if you're getting hired or if you're going to volunteer, if this comes up, what are resources that I use, or what are appropriate psychoeducational things that I can say? And so those are questions to ask when it's part of your training. And so even though these types of callers are striving to fulfill their needs, they often pose problems for telephone workers. So we're going to talk about some techniques to help prepare for those. So handling problem callers, things that you can do is find out right away what the administrative rules are for the agency that you're working at. And then limit the number and duration of calls from a single caller. So make sure that if somebody keeps calling back and asking for you, that's limited. Limit the topics that can be discussed. If they're not in crisis and they're just calling and it's like random, say, I'm only here, I can help you with this, and that. Other than that, I can give you resources or a phone number to call and speak to somebody else, and you can say that. Requiring that only specific workers handling, versed in handling abusive callers take such calls. So if somebody does call with, like, say, for example, a sexual problem, you can connect them with somebody who can take that. Requiring the caller to establish a face-to-face meeting with somebody else. If, for example, they're being aggressive or they're being manipulating or, something else is going on, you can ask them, say this, I think you'd be better suited to talking with somebody in person. I'd like to give you some resources for that, and then end the call that way. And then just make sure that you have a type of management plan for these types of callers. So when you are going to volunteer or when you do go into your field work, handling these types of people, having a plan for them of readily available resources and, social, or I should say, resources, or just like types of questions or anything you can pull. So this is why I know I make some of you guys create that resource folder. I would highly encourage you guys to make sure you have one for handling these specific types of clients, whether it's face-to-face or on the phone. But these borderline, avoidant, self-defeating, bipolar, OCD, histrionic, all of these are like ones that you should have like a little pocket available to help you deal with them, okay? So some of the things you should know is that, there is resistance by many people to work in an internet setting. Even for us right now, school counselors who had to go into virtual counseling or therapists, there's limits to confidentiality that you have to follow. For example, we had to create a disclaimer to tell parents that or students that when we're meeting with them virtually, it is not confidential because we can't guarantee confidentiality. So because this is still fairly new and there's not a lot of research around it, it's so important to inform yourself of your legal and ethical guidelines when it comes to telehealth or online counseling. Make sure you look at the different code of ethics for your license that you're pursuing and know what those are. And then many people, especially nowadays, millennials, they're happily in eager to use technology-based counseling as a sort of therapy. However, it's just important for you to be informed of, what that entails and what the different platforms are and which platforms are HIPAA compliant or FERPA compliant. That's important. I did post that for you under content and resources of like HIPAA versus FERPA when it comes to online telehealth. So it's just really important. So again, I can't stress enough about confidentiality. It's one of the major issues in therapy, and on the net, confidentiality is just not guaranteed. You need to know about encryption programs that are used by ethical therapists and stay informed about different confidentiality limits when it comes to online counseling. And even though some websites may guarantee anonymity, once a message goes out, there's no guarantee that it cannot be pulled out, whether by people or agencies. So it's just important to know that. Also, making sure that you never violate client confidentiality and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, which carries a lot of penalties for doing so. And those are a lot of real concerns for mental health professionals. So knowing when you can disclose information that was shared during online telehealth, that's really important. So that resource I gave you, the Online International Association for Mental Health, that's a great resource. But also just going to your state association for your credential or your license and looking at the legal and ethical guidelines, that's going to be a great resource for you. So Bottom line is there's still just so much more that needs to be done in terms of research and protocol development when it comes to behavioral telehealth and cyber counseling. And so just know that it is going to play a large role, and I feel like it's going to grow in future for crisis intervention. However, it's just so important to have lots of ethical safeguards that still need to be answered, or make sure that you always put in place. And so looking to associations like the American Counseling Association, the National Board of Certified Counselors, and then the one I mentioned recently, the International Society for Mental Health. These are all working hard to have like an online telehealth guideline for you. So make sure that you consult those and educate yourself for that. Okay, that's it for chapter 6. It was short and sweet. And then this ends kind of the foundation stage of crisis counseling that we've been covering. So I'm really excited that after this week, when we get into next week, we're going to go delve more into those special populations. I was going to see if I could bring this up, but it's not going to allow me. Okay, so that ends lecture for today, and I'll see you guys next week on Tuesday.